Well, thank you for joining our podcast today. We're going to be talking about an interesting, kind of hot topic these days, the idea of finding meaning and purpose in life. And recently, I've seen through social media feeds, plugging into something on the television, and people are talking about this. It seems to be a problem where we as Americans are struggling with the whole idea of finding meaning and purpose in our lives. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, just a couple of statistics. One is that one extensive study found that 57% of the adult population are struggling with a sense of meaningless in their lives. And about 25% of the adult population had a strong sense of purpose in their lives.
Those are interesting statistics when we look at what else we're seeing in the research these days, and that is an increase in anxiety, depression, and all-time high of suicidal rates. So it really kind of begs the question, is there a correlation here? What are your thoughts about that?
Allow me to refer to a couple psychiatrists. One is Carl Jung, who said a good proportion of his clients were dealing not with a medical kind of label with their concerns psychologically, but a lack of meaning, sense of emptiness in their lives. And then you think of Viktor Frankl, who was in prison during the Holocaust. And one of his statements was that a lot of the people who died in those concentration camps, it was not because of a lack of food or medicine. It was a lack of a sense of purpose enough to stay alive, to fight to stay alive.
So that raises again another question. Why are people struggling so much? When we think about meaning and purpose in our lives, there are many variables that contribute to that. And so I don't know that it's an easy question to answer necessarily, but you kind of have to break life down a little bit. We've talked before about this whole idea of life themes. Where are we in relationships? Our spiritual relationship, knowing and enjoying relationship with God, meaningful work, having recreative time that puts something back in our tank, expression of gifts and talents. So it's a little bit complicated, isn't it?
It is, but it's something that can be grasped, that can be understood. I think of a time when I was in graduate school. I was taking a philosophy course. It was under Dr. Joe Lennick, a professor, and he gave us the assignment to write out a statement about our sense of life purpose. And I recall that one of the students talked about how he had acquired a house and a family and an income, a job. And he said, that didn't do it. The funny thing is, he said, what I'm looking to now is a bigger house, greater income, maybe adding a person to my family.
Mhm.
It was the same category of stuff that didn't fill his space or sense of meaning.
So that's an important clarification. What gives our life meaning and purpose goes beyond people, stuff, money, objects. There has to be something underlying sort of that drive. Um, it's interesting as well when we look at culture today, and we have information in a split second, what's happening everywhere with everyone about everything. And people are looking at, how can I become the next YouTuber? How can I get so many hits on social media? How can I rise to that level of notoriety and fame and fortune? And very few people reach those levels. And so it seems like we've kind of gone askew a little bit. Instead of focusing on how do I get to that level, it's where have I been planted? What does God call me to do in the way of serving Him, knowing others, finding meaning in completing things that are valuable and contributing towards something, even if we don't know the outcome? or we're not even sure that what we do is going to make a big difference. We're finding meaning in just engaging in what we believe God's called us to do. It seems like we've lost a lot of that. It's kind of the old expression, bloom where you're planted. Find meaning in the world you're living in by connecting and doing good and using your time and your gifts and talents wisely. What are your thoughts about that?
King Solomon, he gathered tremendous amounts of gold, silver, and jewels. He built many houses and gardens and pools. And he actually had 300 concubines for his pleasure, as he put it. He had 700 wives.
Yet when we read Solomon's writings, he concludes by saying all is vanity. So it's not the stuff, it's not the accomplishments. It all falls short of filling our hearts and our souls with meaning and purpose.
That was a conclusion, but at the very end of his writing, and I've jotted down his quote here. And whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil, and this was my reward for all my toil. Then I considered all that my hands had done, and the toil I had expended in doing it. And behold, all was vanity and a striving after wind. There was nothing to be gained under the sun. So that is echoing what you said about a conclusion. But at the very, very end of Ecclesiastes is his final conclusion. The end of the matter, fear God and keep his commandments. For this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil. So he lands back on where he started with his walk with God.
And that brings to light the whole idea of thinking about the why behind what gives us meaning and purpose. And that is, from a spiritual perspective, God has planted me here. He has me here for a purpose. I didn't just show up for nothing. It's all part of God's plan and purpose. And if that's our underlying core belief, each day in my life, I'm going to show up and see what God would have me do with whomever, in what setting, completing what task. And so part of it is, that lofty idea of my great purpose in life. Let's bring it down a few notches. God might take what we do and use it greatly, but no one might ever see it. It doesn't matter, because if I'm engaged in doing what God's called me to do, I'm fulfilling my purpose, which is to serve him and to allow him to use what I'm doing for his purpose and the greater good. We think of people's lives. We've read about somebody like Billy Graham, and God used him greatly. But when you go back through his life, there were quiet people who spoke into his life, people that taught him, that he studied under. You wouldn't know their name. And yet they were used by God to contribute to his learning so God could equip him and use him in the way he wanted to. Those people were no less valuable, had no less meaning and purpose than Billy Graham himself. And yet as a culture, we put the emphasis on, power, prestige, notoriety, that kind of thing. But that's not God's perspective. Those people were equally as important to fulfill God's purpose as Billy Graham was himself.
On a smaller scale, but very important scale, we can find meaning in some of our tasks, our work, our relationships, and so on. But as you're saying very strongly, it is a walk with God. It is honoring God in relationship with him, and growing in intimacy with him, and then doing all that we do in his name to serve him.
Mm-hmm.
And there are no things too small.
Right. It's valuing the small stuff. It's like Chuck Swindoll said once, and other people have as well. Much of life is lived in the mundane. That dinner I cooked last night, the grass that you cut, the laundry that we do, the taking children to the events, the celebrating of the birthday, all those things cumulatively add meaning to our lives. They give us purpose. And yet sometimes we minimize or dismiss those things as just tasks to get done. But they're a big deal. They impact the lives of others. They bring fulfillment to us. We think of sitting with a child or a grandchild, reading a story, talking about the day at school. Those things are so valuable and cumulatively add so much to that child's life. When you think of children who never get that, the impact and sometimes the damage that's done, it's significant. So we need to recognize that our purpose, what gives meaning to life, is not just the things that are done on a grand scale. It's valuing those little things that make such a difference. That's why we're here.
Criticism that comes our way sometimes is that, well, we're just looking through our Christian glasses. And not everybody out there is embracing the Christian faith, embracing Christ, embracing God, walking with God. But look at the information just from a secular perspective, both Carl Jung and Viktor Frankl, who indicated that a good portion of their clients with their psychiatric diagnosis, it was not really a medical condition or a limited psychological condition. It was a lack of a sense of meaning and purpose in their lives. And we also see that there is not only a correlation between a sense of purpose, higher purpose, and health, but also mortality. So that people with a higher sense of purpose tend to live longer than those who are on the lower end of the scale, feeling empty.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned Viktor Frankl, who spent time in the concentration camps during World War II, lost a lot of his family, wrote the well-known, still read book, Man's Search for Meaning. What were his thoughts on people not having meaning and not having purpose, and what was the outcome of that?
One of the things that Viktor Frankl emphasized is freedom of choice.
Mm.
And he said you cannot necessarily, and you cannot in the Holocaust, choose your circumstances that which you were part of. But what you can do is make a decision as how you're going to relate to it, how you're going to respond to it. And he even said that there's a sense of purpose, higher purpose, in walking through difficult times and coming out the other side by making those positive kinds of choices. I will not be put down by this. I'm going to be strong. I'm going to go ahead with my life, regardless of the suffering I'm encountering.
Yeah, and in his book, which you've talked about before, the people that did not do that, they became victim to the circumstances. They didn't make it. That brings, what you're describing brings up something very valuable, I think, for all of us. If we're not finding a sense of meaning and purpose in our lives, what are the barriers to that? What choices are we making that keep us from having that sense of meaning and purpose? Are we isolating? Are we unrealistic? Are we not engaging on a deep level with people? Are we not taking on a posture of serving and helping? Is it all about us sometimes? I'm not getting what I want, therefore life is not meaningful. Well, it's not about us. That's not why God has put us here.
And there's, as you've already implied, there's a strong sense of purpose in giving ourselves away in a positive kind of service, making a difference in our world, even if it's a very small part of the world. And especially if we're offering that as service under God, to God, as we serve other people. But the more we're caught up in just ourselves, the more empty I think we become.
Yeah, and we've both had experiences with people in which someone was feeling not only a lack of meaning and purpose, but depression, even possibly suicidal. And by chance circumstances, something occurred where they had to quickly engage to help someone They were called upon to serve in some way. And almost like with a snap of your fingers, those negative emotions, the depression, anxiety, the suicidal thought, they were gone because they were fully engaged and they found meaning and purpose in helping and serving. That's very interesting dynamic.
In my emptiness and not being filled with what I'm made to be filled with, God has created me with certain kinds of needs for a sense of meaning, a sense of personal worth or dignity, a way of circumventing death. If you do away with God, there is no ultimate meaning to life. There is no real basis for our value, our dignity, and death is inevitable and final.
Mhm. And just one sort of final thought on all of this. We're not saying that in life there aren't times that are difficult. Talking about Viktor Frankl and his experiences, but all of us, there are times when we've lost relationships, a loved one has died, we're in difficult times financially, we've lost a job. Those times can take us into a valley where we're really struggling to find out why am I here? What is my purpose? What is the meaning in these things that are happening to me, so to speak? That is part of the human experience. But again, as you mentioned earlier, in those dark times, difficult times, challenging times where we're struggling, we have choices. We may not have the answers to those questions in those times, but we commit to moving forward. We commit to exploring what God has called us to do. We think of times where we're called to sit with someone who's suffering in the hospital, maybe terminal. It's difficult, it's grueling, and you go and you sit and you hold hands and you try to comfort. And there's meaning in that by itself, but it just feels dark, and it's hard to do it. And yet, as you're suggesting, in retrospect, we look at those times and they grew us up. They made us stronger, more compassionate, more understanding. There is meaning in that, very much.
There are three lines of investment, I think, in achieving a sense of purpose and fulfillment, sense of meaning in life. Just kind of referring back to things we've touched on already. One is the area of vocation. We all have our set of abilities, our aptitudes. We think of gifts for service. And so what is your calling? What is your work where you put the food on the table? And beyond that, are you serving the people around you with the gifts and talents that God has given you? And then secondly, investing ourselves in the special people of our lives. It can't happen without time being spent. And it can't really happen in the corner of a room with people just talking. Out in the front lines of life together, serving, working, laughing, crying, building a sense of intimacy in the people we identify as our inner circle, the special people, and then going beyond that and serving people that can't give us anything back. And then the foundation, I think, is our walk with God through Christ, is death dying on our behalf in terms of our guilt under God, and his resurrection promising life to those who embrace Jesus as both Lord and Savior. And it's not just being religious. It's walking with God. It's a relationship, just like you and I have a relationship. We need to have that kind of walk with God.
Yeah, and what you're saying, it's recognizing, as I mentioned earlier, we are not here by chance. God has put us here for a purpose, and pursuing all those things that you're describing, it's really continuing to equip ourselves to continue to grow and be prepared. So when God opens certain doors, when he leads us in a certain direction, we're ready because we've invested the time and the energy and the work to prepare ourselves for what he's called to and for what is next, whatever that might be. So we never sit and rest on our laurels. We never put our feet up for too long. We're about the business of becoming who he wants us to be. So we are ready to take on what he's called us to do. Well, we hope this has been helpful. It's a challenging subject. Thank you for tuning in.